Good afternoon, or morning, or evening, or whatever. Here we are in the A2A Piper Cherokee at Springbank, which is an airport a ways west of Calgary. It's one of my sort of local airports. Anyway, we are going to Banff, and when I installed this paint scheme, I didn't realize that this was in here until afterwards, and it was just a beautiful coincidence. But that's where we're going. Paint scheme is the Calgary Flying Club, which is based at Springbank, although they don't actually have any Cherokees. They used to have a Warrior, but they don't anymore. But that doesn't really matter so much. It's all for the sake of authenticity. But I am still running Orbex Northern Rockies for the scenery, and I'm now running Rex Essential plus Overdrive for the weather, and that'll update every once in a while, and there'll be a little thing in the corner. It's not quite as subtle as it could be when it updates the weather, but I have no complaints. It looks amazing, and I actually get a somewhat better frame rate when running it than the default FSX weather, which I don't know why that happens, but we're going to look in the maintenance hangar and see some of the options I've got for this aircraft. I have the engine heater, gap seals, roof fairings, everything you could possibly throw into it in terms of the optional exterior stuff and things like that. I'm going to keep the Airhawk tires on, even though we're going to be landing on a very rough grass strip in Banff. It's not really maintained. But I recently replaced cylinders 1 and 4, so now these are all really good. I have the multi-weight oil, massive electrode spark plugs. We're not going to dwell on the maintenance for too long. We're just going to jump in with the Walkaround. I've actually done the Walkaround a couple times on real 172s, but never a Cherokee. So we're going to release the control lock, which is just the seat belts, which I think is amazing. In the A2A Comanche, it's a bungee cord. I do have that. We'll be flying it at some point, but not right now. Turn the master on and check fuel quantity. I'm kind of tempted to actually put a little bit of fuel into this, but I think we'll make it. And we're actually going to set this to the right tank because we're going to need to do that anyway. Set it to the fullest tank, and we're all good. So master switch off, ignition off, and we will extend the flaps with that big lever. Because this is a Piper, it has manual flaps. And then we'll jiggle the flaps and make sure there's not too much play in them. They shouldn't be all over the place, but and then we'll check the connections, make sure they're functioning. We'll also check the aileron, make sure it moves the way it should, and that all the connections and hinges are working as they should be. Tie downs are not installed. I actually flew this today. I actually flew the trip to Banff earlier, but the audio didn't record, so we're doing it again. But that's for your benefit, because I actually know what's where now. In fact, we're going to put a little bit of oil into this, because it's an old airplane. It consumes a little bit of oil as time goes on. The Comanche really burns a fair bit of oil. Although I'm pretty sure this is a 1962 Cherokee and the Comanche is a 59. Because it's based on Scott's of A2A's personal aircraft. So it must have been kind of convenient for them to flight test that. And I really like the Comanche actually. If I ever owned an actual airplane, it would probably be a Comanche, because it fulfills the coveted requirement capacity for 4 schlubs and their golf clubs, which the Cherokee can't quite do unless you really don't have a lot of fuel in it. And the Comanche can get quite a lot of range, but that's neither here nor there. We're still in the Cherokee, and I'm sure I've gotten the names confused a couple of times by now. I know I'm not the only person who does that, but weight and balance, it's me and fuel. We're actually gonna put a little bit in the left. Don't tell anyone. Our control wheel lock is removed, the cabin door is closed and secured. You need to hear this door, okay? Because when this door closes, you could kill someone with that door, or at least it sounds like it. Well, I'm sure you could. And our control wheel lock is removed, our controls are free and correct, and we'll actually just check them really quickly. We can't see the elevator from the cabin, but we saw it in the walk around, so we should be fine. Ignition and avionics are off. We'll turn the master switch on, check the fuel quantity. Right tank is still fuller, so we'll keep that. We'll retract the flaps, and we will set the elevator trim for takeoff. It really just needs to be neutral, and the beacon is on. Typically, At least in my experience, and this is the standard practice of the school I've been taking lessons with, they just leave the beacon on so it comes off with the battery. Because in this country, if you're in uncrowded airspace, flying VFR in daylight, they only really need you to have the beacon on. But our wheel brakes are on, we just have the parking brake. Carb heat is off. I bound it to a switch, so it's just on and off. You don't really want carb heat on the ground too much because you'll ingest crap into the engine. Our master switch is still on from 30 seconds ago. We'll test the electric fuel pump, and we will watch for the fuel pressure to rise, and there it goes. And we will prime the engine. We're going to give it 2 because it's pretty warm. And the cabin is warm, so we're going to open the window. So, mixture rich, throttle cracked, about 1/4 of an inch or 2.5 notches on my X55 throttle. I'm flying this with the X55. I know the real airplane has a yoke and I'm flying it with a stick. Who cares? Probably a lot of people actually, but area, cover your ears. Clear! And then, ignition both. We'll close that window. I'm sure someone heard that. We're not going to worry at this time. So, and then we engage the starter. And she roars to life. That's good. Usually it takes a little more, and we're going to lean out the mixture a fair bit, almost a half. Typically is a good ground setting for this airport. What we're actually going to do is keep going until the RPM drops, and then feed it back in a fair amount, actually. You want to be a ways rich of that, because if you have the mixture lean too much, you can cause detonation, which is exactly as bad as it sounds. It can do some pretty serious damage to the engine. So, oil pressure is up. If you don't have oil pressure up within 30 seconds, you're going to do some pretty serious damage to the engine. And ammeter, positive, and nav lights, we're not going to worry about them. It's a nice day. Altimeter, the airport elevation's just a hair under 4,000 feet, so that's mostly set correctly. Alright, heading, typically we cross-reference it against the magnetic compass. It looks okay. We'll turn on the radio master and the radios, including the GPS, because we're going to use the GPS. I'm not going to navigate by my wits, although I'm pretty sure I could actually get to Banff without any difficulties, but it's Charlie Yankee Bravo Alpha, and we'll just do that. I don't have any of the third-party GPSs. This is really just a face on the default FSX GPS, which is fine by me, because GPS is kind of cheating anyway, but we're going to do it this time. We're not going to follow the route directly because we'd have to climb quite a lot to be able to do that. So we're actually going to get the cabin vent going so that the cabin can cool off and we can get some air in once we're flying at least. Keep that power at 1,000 RPM. It climbs up as the engine warms up. And I think we're about good. We are going to go to, there is a dedicated run-up bay next to the runway that we're going to, which is 3-4, which is right here. It's a nice short taxi. We'll do the run up here. I haven't bothered with ATIS, and I can't find a windsock, so we don't know exactly the wind direction, but it's fairly calm. Typically when we do the run up, we want to be facing into the wind, and actually during the taxi, you want to have sort of crosswind controls. So if the wind is coming from your right, you would turn the yoke to the right, basically. And that's just to sort of save the control surfaces. The other thing you kind of want to do is hold the yoke back somewhat during taxi. Saves the nose wheel a little bit of wear over time because it puts, well, it relieves the pressure on a little bit because you can actually see the tail will visibly go down if we pull the yoke all the way back because that stabilator deflects quite a lot of air from the prop. Because you get the slipstream back there, which is all well and good. But the other thing we're going to do once we're taxiing in a straight line is we're going to test the brakes. Typically you do that on initial roll, but I forgot. So there's the brakes. They're seeming okay. The brakes can be a little weak on the Cherokee, but it's an old airplane, and we don't have a lot of load in it, so we should be okay to stop in Banff if we don't crash, because good grief, it's bumpy. I've seen the actual runway in Banff, and it doesn't seem as bad as Orbex is portraying, but you never know. See the run-up bay, oh, and there goes Rex. I don't know why it needs to do this. I would never notice its little weather injection, but you know, it's worth it to get real world weather. It's really kind of cool. We'll probably notice a lot of haze in flight. There's been a lot of smoke around the province lately because there's a bit of fire now and then. But here we go into the run-up bay, throwing caution to the wind, not caring which way. Literally the wind, not caring which way the wind is blowing. We're just gonna face so that we can taxi right off. And we'll just wait until the nose wheel straightens out, and it actually has, but I cheated. Alright, so for the run-up, we run it up to 2,000 RPM, and there she goes. And the first thing we're going to do is our mag check, so we'll check each mag, make sure the drop in RPM does not exceed 125. So, left, back to both, drop was about 80, right, back to both, the drop was about the same, turn on the, that's not the carb heat, we'll turn on the carb heat and check for an RPM drop, we get it, and then actually what we're going to do is check the engine instruments. They're all in the green, and then we bring the throttle back to idle, and with the carb heat on, if the engine doesn't quit, we should be good to go. It'll bottom out pretty low, so we want to get it back up to 1,000 RPM pretty quickly so we don't foul the plugs, but we're good to go now. So for takeoff, we'll ensure that seats and seat belts, doors, they're all secured. Our flight controls are free and correct. We already checked their movement, I'm not going to do it again. Elevator trim is set. Mixture, it says to put it to rich, but we are at almost 4,000 feet of elevation. We're not going to do that. We're actually at some of the highest elevation in the country that is at the top of a mountain, and because we're on the bald prairie, but that's not a big thing. So carb heat is off, fuel selector is still on the fullest tank. We'll turn on the electric fuel pump. Engine gauges are still normal, and flaps will be taking off with flaps up. It's a fairly long runway, and we're pretty light, so we're not going to worry about it. And here we go. And now normally we would stop short of the hold short line and complete those items, but I just did it at the run-up bay, so we'll check left and check right. Often I've heard some conflicting theories, but when you stop on the hold short line, you can actually angle the aircraft towards the direction that a landing aircraft would be coming from. Helps you see it better, and then it knows you can see it, basically. But we advance the throttle to full in about a 2-second motion is usually best for the engine. And airspeed's alive, coming up through 40 knots. I am going to plug in the headset. Normally in a real aircraft you do that right when you get in, and then you put it on once you get the battery or the avionics turned on, whatever engages the intercom depending on the aircraft. But we're already up to 80 knots, that's going to be our climb out speed. And once we get to 4,500 feet we'll start our turn out over to Banff, and we're actually going to set the GPS to terrain. And we're all good. We'll just hold this heading, mostly with the rudder, but with a little bit of aileron. And okay, they're just coming up through 4,300 feet. 100 to go before the turn. And there's 4,500 coming up. We'll start the turn. And a climbing turn, you don't really want to exceed 30 degrees, at least in a 172. I'm not sure about the Cherokee. Because in the 172, like, it'll barely climb if you exceed 30 degrees of bank in a climb. Because its engine doesn't have quite as much nip to it. Although interesting, I guess that's not the right way to put it, because it has basically the same engine as the Cherokee. So it's really a difference in airframe and propeller, really. It's still the Lycoming 360 cubic inch engine. There we are, turning off to the right to just join the course. Once we get into the mountains proper, we'll sort of turn to the left and follow the Trans-Canada Highway alongside the river, which runs a ways to the south. That'll take us past Canmore, and I don't know if we'll be able to spot the casino on the way into the foothills. I don't know if Orbex have gone quite that far, but we will certainly see. Might have heard a key there, just turning my computer volume down a little bit. We're going to climb to about 6,000 feet. We want to keep it below the cloud layer, so we might have to adjust once we get there. I'm going to hand fly it for a while. I'll probably use the autopilot at some point, because the autopilot in this aircraft is interesting. It's not so much an autopilot as a beep at you until you trim it properly, at least in terms of the altitude hold. but it will hold heading and GPS course, and it can do radials as well, VOR and everything. But we're about 100 below 6,000 feet. We've been more or less holding our climb rate at 90 miles an hour. It's not knots in this Cherokee, it's miles an hour. It's an older machine. So we push the nose forward. When we're climbing, it's altitude, then power, then trim. We hold the nose forward until the speed comes up, and there it is, coming through 100 knots. And then we'll pull it back to about 2300 RPM for the cruise. And it wants to climb because we haven't trimmed it, so we're going to trim it now. And there we are in cruise. I'm not going to set it for flight for maximum range because we do want to be at least somewhat timely. The flight itself is probably going to take about, a little over 20 minutes. And we're not perfectly aligned towards it actually, so we're going to make a little bit of an adjustment to our course. But we should be entering the foothills and passing over Scott Lake Hill, and I'm not sure if this is it or not, because I kind of think it is. Because it's actually the highest point on the Trans-Canada Highway. It's at about 4,000 feet. It's about the same altitude as Springbank, but even the Rogers Pass, which is in the mountains way the heck over there, like about 80 miles that way, is still lower. Because we have pretty high altitudes here by comparison, and by many laws of mostly meteorology and how the planet's supposed to develop, by all rights this whole area should be a desert, and apparently it's going to be in the next 50 years or something. I don't know, it gets pretty deserty east of Calgary as you get towards Drumheller, but then you get to Saskatchewan and it's just... I think flying in Saskatchewan would be pretty boring compared to where we're going into the mountains because most of it is flat. To be fair, I've only been there once, and the only part that I've been to actually was fairly hilly, but that's neither here nor there. Actually, I've never been further east in this country than the southwest corner of Saskatchewan. I should be ashamed. I think, I've maybe flown over it a little further going to Minneapolis, but that's about it. That was on a Delta Airbus A319, which was lovely, by the way. But I have SkyVector.net, which is a free website that gives you charts, although the ones for Canada aren't great because Transport Canada withholds those because they like you to pay for them, so they're not proper charts per se, but they have a fair amount of information. So, we're actually going to get down to the business of leaning the mixture a little bit better now. For the most part, we're just going to lean it by ear. So there the engine kind of, and then we feed it back in. That'll usually get us about 50 degrees rich of peak EGT, which is a fairly recommendable cruise setting. It sort of balances economy and where the engine wants to be, in general wear of the engine. Because obviously you don't want it lean too much because then you'll get detonation, and you don't want it too rich because you'll get fouled plugs and quite conceivably engine failure at higher altitudes because the fuel mixture is just so far gone from where it needs to be. So that's worth keeping in mind. I should see if I've forgotten anything really glaring. I'm sure I have and someone's noticed it by now, but we're not really caring at this time. So yeah, I think that was definitely Scott Lake Hill back there. So that's good. That means we're getting into the foothills. That means it's going to get to be a little bit more scenic. It's also kind of gray, but it's also really pretty because I'm really liking Rex for the weather. And also the ground textures at the airport were Rex as well, oddly combined with Orbex's redoing of all the airports in the area because, like I said, this is the Northern Rockies scenery area, which is really great because it's sort of my area. I kind of want to do a lot of flights in this area, actually, either in the Cherokee or the Comanche. Great thing about the Comanche is it's a little faster, so you're not having to sit through the long haul, although when you're flying in the mountains it's really not so bad. But we're actually just going to start following the Trans-Canada Highway, which is running right here, so that'll take us right through Canmore and eventually to Banff. I don't know. No, so Scott Lake Hill... Okay. No, I think the casino's over here somewhere. There's a casino, a big casino nonetheless. where they do helicopter tours and things like that. It's on the, I believe it's on the First Nations reserve land actually, but I'm not going to get into that. That's kind of a murky area in this country. What the heck is that? We've got red. I'm not going to question the red. Alright. We're just gonna continue as if nothing's happening. There's the weather loaded in. The frame rate dipped a little bit when it did that, but it's getting exceptionally ugly, but we're still below the clouds, so we are okay. We're actually maintaining approximately 6,000 feet pretty well. One thing that is certainly well depicted in especially A2A aircraft that really is a maddening thing in real aircraft is it is tricky to maintain altitude. It's really always creeping up or down, and apparently eventually you get to the point where you just do that without thinking about it, but I only have about 4 hours, so I'm not quite at that point, and also in a 172, not a Cherokee. Although if I had to choose between the two of one to have as a personal aircraft, the Cherokee would win by so many factors, because for one thing, it's a little faster in cruise, and it's so pretty. Even with this kinda ugly maroon burgundy paint scheme that the Calgary Flying Club insists upon. I've actually flown in a couple of their aircraft at some point. I've never flown any of them, but flown in 2 of their 172s. They've expanded their fleet quite a lot lately. They have 152s, 172s, they have A182, Diamond DA20s, and I think they bought a Cirrus SR20 recently. And they have a Piper Seminole, I think? Seminole? I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but it's their 4-seat twin engine that they use for IFR training. And I believe they have a Redbird simulator there. In fact, yes, I know they have, because I've seen it. And they have the airport elevation in big letters on the balcony, and there's a pool table and everything. It's wonderful. And there's a cupboard underneath the stairs, and it says H. Potter on the door. And the whole thing's there as a prank. There's actually nothing behind it but wall. But I should have done this in the Comanche, because it would have gone faster, and I wouldn't have gotten into my incessant waffling, which I'm sure is driving you all out of your minds. But I'm actually going to have a look in this, because I've got the volume turned all the way down so I can be absolutely certain you can hear me. What's the temperature in the cabin like? Nice and steady. We can open the window if we wanted to, and if we were flying over Saharan Africa, we could open this and drop a Coke bottle out the window, and a bunch of people on the ground who had never seen one before would start worshipping it. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then that's unfortunate. Take them to the helicopter. Anyway, let's actually run through, make sure I haven't forgotten anything for cruise. So 2200 to 2650 RPM, we're at 2300-ish. We're a little below it actually, but that's fine. Our elevator, well, we're actually trimmed pretty well. We're getting a little bit below 6,000 feet now, so we're going to really just keep it level. Typically, if you're within 50 feet either way, the typical instructor is not going to get too mad at you. And we've leaned the mixture by ear, so we are okay. Oop, but our fuel pump's still on. Oops! I hope that doesn't do anything awful. Usually it doesn't. But we're going to follow the highway, which runs through this valley to the south, past Canmore, and then up to Banff. And it's going to be lovely and cloudy. Yuck. It's hideous. I'm not using TrackIR or EasyDock or anything. I did have TrackIR at one point, but I more or less busted it. And I've looked at a few of the free utilities like FaceTrack Noir, and apparently there's a whole bunch of weird stuff you have to do to get that working with FSX Steam Edition, which this is. I finally just bought the Steam Edition because it was on sale for like $2.50, and having it on Steam is really kind of convenient, and basically every add-on is compatible with it now. There are some issues in the early going, but I don't have nearly as many compatibility issues with Windows 8.1 now, and it's just ducky. And it seems to run a little better at least, I don't know. But we can still peak at the EGT. It's about 50 degrees richer peak, which is perfect. Well, that's where I had it set to peak for last time. But there aren't any nav aids in Banff, so we are navigating by our wits, essentially. You can sort of go left or right here. If you go left, I think you'll end up in radium, maybe, eventually, but we're not going to do that. If you want to end up there, you should go south through the Crow's Nest Pass. But I guess that doesn't matter so much when you're flying, because you can kind of go in a straight line, depending how high you're capable of climbing, which is a great thing about the Comanche. It can cruise at 10,000 feet easily. You don't really want to cruise above that unless you really want to be on oxygen the whole time. Apparently Piper experimented with making a pressurized version of the Comanche, but it didn't really go anywhere, so it's either that or oxygen. If you're in this country, if you're above 10,000 feet, you need to be on oxygen if you're flying for more than 30 minutes, and if you're above 13,000 feet, you just always need to be on oxygen. Which is very interesting and kind of inconvenient, which is why people don't like to fly that high, because it'll get kind of moist. This interior, by the way, in some of the other paint schemes it's really red and it looks like a proper 50s diner in here, but it's not such a bad cabin. It looks like you have a decent amount of legroom in the back. Ooh, fire extinguisher. Our needle's in the green by the looks of it. That's good. That means if there's a fire, we can extinguish it. Hence the purpose. And also land immediately. This area would be pretty good if the engine suddenly quit. Kind of convenient thing about flying on the prairies as opposed to in the mountains is you can land pretty much anywhere. It's the same in urban areas. It's all well and good if you have an engine failure and you can land in a field, but if you're taking off from an airport like Edmonton City Centre, which is closed now, and suddenly your engine fails and you're not high enough to make it back to the field, and it's just that you have a choice of a few places to crash. If you're choosing between an orphanage, a nuclear waste pond, and a hospital, it's hard to choose the right one. But if you're in the mountains, it's even worse, because you're probably just going to smack into something. You'd want to land in a valley or maybe on a ridge if you're really going to try your luck, but one of the reasons we're following the highway is because you could conceivably land on it in some of these straighter stretches. In fact, I was watching a promotional video for the Cessna 182 from 1999, and one of the things they sort of advertised is the ability to make off-airport takeoffs and landings. Ignore the buzz in the background, it's inconsequential. And I kind of want to try that in the A2A Cessna 182 at some point, because it looks like it could be interesting. We could give it a go right here. But we're not going to do that right now in this aircraft, because we have fairings to think about. Although, we really shouldn't be going and landing on a grass runway anyway. This basically looks like a golf course over here. There's stuff in this area. I think the casino is actually back there. I don't think Morbeck's modeled the casino. Oh well. We'll just have to deal with that. But, so up ahead here, there's a turn to the right, and then we go over Canmore and then Banff. So we're not too far out. What's the GPS say about our ETA? So we're about halfway there. We're at the 10 minutes out at this point, and we are looking just ducky. We're going to make it. We have plenty of fuel. We're not going to run out, although actually we should check. Our fuel quantities in both tanks are about the same now, so we'll run it on, we're actually going to run it on the left, because when I just have one person in the airplane sitting on the left, if there's a little less fuel in the left tank, it'll balance out a little better, and we won't have to be worrying about correcting roll the whole time. Speaking of which, I have not engaged the autopilot, which makes me very happy because I'm not a cheat. And also the Cherokee, it flies pretty effortlessly once you get it trimmed, which indeed we have, because I'm not even touching the controls at this point. I've just got it fairly centered, and I have to adjust it left and right now and then, and that's about it. Bring the nose up a little bit, but we're still above our intended cruising altitude, so we'll let ourselves creep back down to it. If you're not at your intended altitude, you should always be sort of creeping towards it is ideal. And that was probably not very good English. Our transponder is on 1200, which is standard for VFR in this country, I believe. I think we're the same as the US, but there are a few specific ones. They'll tell you to squawk a specific one, obviously, if you're communicating with ATC, which we're not. There's one for emergencies and things like that. I wonder, they should really have a specific one for my radio doesn't work. Although, by the way, if your radio does stop working and you're intending to be landing at a towered airport, what you should do is circle 500 feet. You should just circle the tower 500 feet above the circuit altitude and wait until they start flashing at you with fancy lights. Because they have red lights and green lights that mean specific things, and I can only remember what some of them are. A solid green light means you can land, and yeah, stuff like that. So that's what to do if your radio quits, or if you don't have one. In which case, landing at a towered airport would be a pain in the buttocks for all involved parties. But yeah, we are passing over a lake here. I don't know the name of this lake, but I think there's like a big sulfur plant on the edge of it or something. And also, I believe the railway runs past here, and it sort of tunnels through this mountain somewhere. There are a lot of interesting things here. I should do more flights in this area. I'm reasonably familiar with it, but this morning I couldn't even figure out where Canmore was going to be, but there's actually a helipad there that Orbex have bothered to depict, which is great, because it's not actually on the chart that I'm looking at on SkyVector, which is kind of understandable, because like I said, they're not proper VFR charts for this country like they have for the US. Because in this country, Transport Canada, yeah, they like to charge for that stuff. Because, well, I think they like to make flying cost prohibitive, which is unfortunate because it's delicious and fun. But I'm not going to rant about Transport Canada because they might be listening, and they might not renew my medical in 5 years.
No smoking in the aircraft.
In the A2A Comanche, actually, it's a 1959 Comanche. There's an ashtray in it. That's not what this is, by the way. That's the cabin vent. But in the Comanche, there actually is one. Although I believe this is a 62 Cherokee, as I believe I mentioned. So I wouldn't be surprised if it had one, because I'm pretty sure it was still legal at that point. I think it was still legal to smoke, at least in commercial aircraft, up until the 80s. I'm not sure about private aircraft. I don't know. I don't know if there even are laws surrounding it in private aircraft. You'd hope. Lovely floodlight in this machine, and you can rig for red. Although it looks kind of pink, almost like a DC-10 or something. But we are going to turn right to head further up the valley, and we should be coming across Canmore not too soon. Yeah, there it is on the right. Jolly good. That means we're not too far from Banff at this time. Canmore, it's lovely, and a bunch of it flooded 2 years ago. Because the Bow River runs right past it, and there's a lot of rainfall and glacial melting and stuff like that. And the place where I was flying last time, High River, doesn't have that name for no reason. It had a similar issue. River's awfully green here. You can't actually see the river from the road in that many places, so I'm going to assume that's what it's actually like. Some bodies of water that I have actually seen, like Gull Lake, are actually pretty green and actually horrendously dirty and ugh. Sometimes, anyway, it's also just very shallow and weedy and horrible. But there's Canmore, and you can see there's the helipad, the heliports, or whatever you'd like to call it, that's there. And it's sort of lovely, and the water turns very blue as it runs through town. I could not tell you why. But we're going to carry on because we are not very far away from Banff. Once we get there, we're going to sort of sightsee around the town a little bit. We're going to fly past the Banff Springs Hotel, or rather the Fairmont Banff Springs Hotel, because it is there in all its glory, and it's 150 years old or something like that. It was built by the railway, I believe, quite some time ago, and it's where the Queen stays when she visits this part of the country. There's a royalty suite there. I think Rex is about to load its weather again, because it just twitched a little bit, which is for the best because it means we can see more. And okay, yeah, I don't know why that turns so blue, but you never know. I don't usually fly helicopters in FSX, but I'd be tempted to, just to fly around this area from there, because you can start there. It shows up on the GPS. I'm sure you can anyway. And we come to another fork in the road. Once again, if you go left, you'll probably end up in Radium or something. And we are not going there. We're going to Banff, which is lovely, but it's lovelier in the winter, and there are less people there in the winter. So if you're going to go there, go in the winter. It's also prettier, because the mountains are snow-capped, and it's, yeah, it's rather splendid. Golf course. I think it's a golf course anyway. Fair few golf courses. There's a lot of golfing to be had here. And I was told a story where apparently a Japanese tourist or something was in this part of the country and golfing somewhere and hit a golf ball, and it hit a goose in the head and killed it, and the guy thought he was going to go to prison for like 40 years for killing a Canadian goose in Canada. And apparently that goose is now stuffed in a museum in, I think it's in Banff, and next to a sign that says all animals died of natural causes. So we're defining natural pretty broadly, shall we say. But if we hit a goose in this Cherokee, it would probably be catastrophic just about anywhere, because those things are big. You don't really realize it. But if it came through the windscreen, it would smash right through it. If it hit the prop, it would bend it. If it hit the wings or the landing gear, it would not be good. But birds aren't really a thing that are simulated here, unfortunately. That would be interesting, because everyone knows what a goose can do if it's ingested into the engine of an Airbus A320. And if it can do that to an Airbus, I'd hate to think what it could do to a Piper. Although we have had a few cases of pretty serious bird strikes in this area in the past, so it's worth noting. Although I'm sort of inclined to wonder how high bugs can fly. Okay, I'm going to go on another tangent, because there was a fly buzzing around in the cockpit of one of the 172s I was in a while ago. And I sort of wondered what would happen if you opened the window and let it out. And this was at 6,500 feet, like 2,000 feet AGL. Would it know what to do with itself? Actually, it's 3,000 AGL. Would it know what to do? Would it just plummet? Would it be able to keep itself level? Who knows? There were a lot of dead bugs in that airplane, actually. Nestled, wedged between the panel and the windscreen, and I'd hate to think what would happen to them if you did 0G, because it'd probably all float up. That's it. I'm sure a very good thought you've got in your head now, just bugs. But as far as I know, this Cherokee is impeccably clean. I mean, it looks pretty well kept. There's no torn upholstery or anything, which is great to see, because it's an airplane that's old, but that's been well loved. Because you don't want to have necessarily a whole lot of problems. And I'm sure in older airplanes it's something you could find, because if this is a 62 Cherokee, it's 53 years old, and the A2A Comanche, which is supposed to be a 59, so that'll be 56 years old. It's interesting, because airplanes tend to have a much longer lifespan than automobiles. They're not considered vintage for a while. Although, if you want to spy a vintage aircraft in Canada, typically, so you have the call sign, the tail number will start with C, but if you see a vintage aircraft, it'll be CF before the dash. But yeah, so for our tail number system, they always start with the C, and then the second letter is always either an F or a G. So we never say the C when communicating with ATC, so this aircraft would just be Golf X-Ray Hotel Oscar. And if we were flying into another country, we would say it either as Charlie or Canadian, so that, well, and people tend to fly to the US quite a bit. Anyway, Banff is right up here, and that's actually the sort of the airfield you can see beside the road. I'm pretty sure it's not nearly as rough in real life as it's depicted to be here, but don't take my word for it. We're going to go find the hotel before we land, because who knows? if we're rich enough to have an airplane, maybe we're rich enough to stay at the Fairmont Banff Springs Hotel. One never does know. And actually, in High River a few days ago, there was someone who had an Embraer Phenom 300, which is a business jet if you've been living with your head in a bucket. And it actually took off right before we did, except the instructor and I was just sitting in this 172, not so far from being right behind it, just holding the brakes, hoping it doesn't blow us away. And it was blowing jet blast right at a great big fuel tank, so I just hope it's not that hot from that distance. But High River is not a big airport. It has a 3,000-foot runway, and they used every inch of it. But it was quite the thing to see there. It's probably one of the people who works on one of the television shows that's filmed there, like Heartland or something. Because I don't think there's anyone that rich in town, because if you were that rich, why would you live in High River? It would be a pretty major liability when the town floods every 10 years, but shh. You didn't hear me say that. Anyway, you can see the hotel. Because I have family who live in High River and they don't think it's done. But there's the Fairmont Banff Springs Hotel. I don't know if there's actually a golf course behind it. But it's very pretty, although the color isn't exactly right. It's kind of more, actually, it's kind of the same color as the burgundy trim on this airplane, but there it is. I haven't stayed there, but I've been there and stood in the lobby like an idiot, and apparently it's haunted. Apparently there are ghosts, but I'm not going to worry about that. We're going to start our descent. We're going to bring the throttle back to 1500 RPM. Who left the carb heat on? That's not good. We shouldn't have done that. Oh well. Hopefully I haven't broken anything. Or maybe I just fat-fingered it at some point and it hasn't been on the whole time. I don't know. But we're going to descend to 5,400 feet, which is going to be our pattern altitude for the Banff airfield. We can't really make a particularly proper traffic pattern because there's so many mountains and hills around, but there it is. It's not very flat, and we'd be better off landing on the highway if I'm honest, but we're not going to do that because I've heard conflicting things about the Banff airport. I don't think anyone really maintains it, so it's not necessarily in the best shape, but we're going to turn the fuel pump on and make sure the fuel selector is where we want it to be, as indeed it is. And here we go. Alright, now that the speed's back, we're going to bring out the first stage of flaps, and then second stage of flaps. Typically in the 172s in High River we land with flaps 20, but here we're going to be 30 because it's a pretty short strip, and we want to touch down at the lowest possible speed to keep us from bouncing around too much, especially since I don't have the sort of grass optimized tires on this aircraft, which are the AirTrack tires. It's really cool, all the options that A2A have for that sort of thing, but here we go. It's hard to discern where the actual runway is supposed to be, and it doesn't really matter too much. It's going to be rough wherever you land it, but if we look at the GPS very briefly, you can sort of see where it runs. So we're going to make a left turn before touchdown. You can sort of discern where it's kind of meant to be, but here we come over the road, scaring the crap out of the non-existent motorists. And we want to be keeping up enough speed so we don't get into slow flight, because then we'll pancake. And there's the windsock. A perfect crosswind. Beautiful. Who built this place? The municipality. Oh, we're gonna smack into the ground so hard. Oh well. Here we go! Actually, that wasn't nearly as bad as I thought. We're gonna try and not be on the brakes too much, because then that'll just bounce us around even more. That being said, I want to get slowed down before we get catapulted back into the air by this sort of lift up here. Alright, now we're on the ground. We turn the transponder. We're just gonna turn it right off, turn off all our radios. And we're gonna turn the carb heat off immediately because we don't want crap getting ingested into the engine. Like I said before, you don't want to run it on the ground at all, for precisely that reason, and especially on unpaved surfaces. You don't really want to be stopping at all on unpaved surfaces. So we're just going to stop here and face the highway. I don't really care where we're stopped. And we are going to turn off the fuel pump and all of our any other systems. Our electrics are off, our radio is off, and we will just bring the throttle back, and when the RPM sort of bottoms out, we'll bring the mixer out, we'll unplug the headset, and then once that shuts down, ignition off and master off, set the parking brake, and welcome to Banff. We didn't break the airplane landing, which is, I think we could define that as a pretty decent miracle, but I wasn't going to taxi up there because it's weird. But here we are. I've seen some peculiar freeware scenery of this airport where there's like gigantic bears walking across the runway. I'm pretty sure it was made by someone who's never been here and thinks this is the land of milk and honey and magic and skiing, which it kind of is, but here we are. The town's over there. Go to Tim Hortons. There's probably 3 or 4 of them in Banff. But yeah, that is... I'm going to stop waffling. So, I have been Mr. 66D flying, I don't know what to say, flying the A2A Cherokee in FSX. That'll be all. Here we are in Banff. Toodaloo. I wonder how the park pass system works if you fly. Shut up!